You may have noticed that it's been a while since I last released an episode of Interesting Lives. The last one was Harvey Milk back in February of last year. There's a rhythm to these, conceptually. I try to showcase the best and the worst and the in the middle of humanity. And this one truly is one of the worst. I knew from reputation, because he was obviously up next on my schedule, I knew how vile the shit that he had done was, and I felt it wasn't very good for my mental health to sort of immerse myself in researching that kind of stuff for several weeks. So that's why this video is a little late, and honestly, Jesus fucking Christ. Shiro Ishii is one of the biggest pieces of shit to ever disgrace the concept of humanity with his existence. I'm gonna basically put a trigger warning for everything here because we're gonna be talking about some really dark and horrendous shit. And I feel it would be wrong of me to pull any punches in my descriptions of these things. To give you sort of frame of reference, Shiro Ishii is often referred to as the Japanese Josef Mengele, but I don't think that description quite cuts it. Shiro Ishii makes Josef Mengele look like Dr. Dolittle. And if you know anything about Josef Mengele, you know how dark this is going to be getting. But let's start at the beginning. Ishii Shiro was born on the 25th of June 1892 into a very wealthy and powerful family in Shibayama, in the Sanbu district of the Chiba prefecture. His father, Katsuya Ishii, was a sake brewer by trade, but factually acted as a sort of feudal landlord over the people of the area. I tried finding the sake brand, by the way, because I figured maybe they still make it. That would be a very interesting, like, sort of witness to history type deal, but I just didn't find it. I did for a second think that in Shibayama they make a special type of ceramic cup, but I'm pretty sure that is some sort of anime thing. Look, I will learn about war crimes, but miss me with that anime shit. He eventually went to a high school in Kanazawa in the Ishikawa prefecture, which I assume is some sort of boarding school, but I wasn't able to verify this. He certainly didn't ride the bus across half the country every day. This may well be where his original fascination with infectious disease and bacteriology medical science came from, because the school was part of a sort of larger, at this point loose association of medical institutions, partly very much responsible for administering smallpox vaccines. They were later joined into the modern Kanazawa University. Throughout his entire educational career, Shiro Ishii was a bit of a grade grubber, bit of a snitch, bit of that one kid that's always sitting up front, always thinking he's better than everyone else, which would have been exacerbated by his social status. You know, the kid nobody likes. And to be fair, he was definitely pretty clever. He had a photographic memory, was quick to conceptualize and extrapolate, and always willing to put in some extra work if it meant getting a thumbs up from the teachers. Naturally, he ended up studying medicine at Kyoto Imperial University, which interestingly had been founded in 1897, 5 years after his birth. A similar thing was the case with his high school, which was built just a year before he was born, and many other institutions. This may just seem like an interesting, or, rather actually just a piece of trivia, but it helps think about putting yourself in the shoes of a young person in Japan at the time, seeing the country rapidly modernizing, changing, growing, more powerful specifically, but also just growing in general, into a new thing, and that is what you will inherit. Especially if you were born into the upper class, you might very much get swept up in the fever of that prosperity and be very optimistic about the future, become rather enamored with the concept of your country. You'd feel like you were one of the chosen people at the dawn of a golden age. In 1921, aged 29, Shiro Ishii joined the Imperial Japanese Army as a surgeon and was reassigned to an army medical school in Tokyo, only to be sent back to his old uni in Kyoto because his professors realized they had such a talent on their hands, he needed access to educational resources they simply couldn't provide with their military focus. They just didn't have a post-grad program, is what I'm saying. Though he was unmistakably highly intelligent, part of this may have also been a little bit due to his teacher's pet fetish, because he did used to work in the labs late at night and grow bacterial cultures that he kept as pets, which is not normal and wasn't seen as a normal thing that bacteriologists just did. But it was very effective at getting him attention. And still, his fellow students didn't like him at all because it was mostly bullshit. Because the real reason the professors would find him working in the lab late at night is because he was out drinking with his mates all day, and then come in, take the meticulously cleaned lab equipment to do his experiments with. And then he wouldn't clean them. If you've ever had to clean equipment in a biology lab, you know how much of a cunt move that is. Especially as he gained minor positions of authority, he'd become a little psycho despot, as you might expect, just not caring about other people's problems, especially not the problems of those under his care, and just getting infuriated the second someone wasn't able to keep up with his very rapid intellectual pace. He clearly wasn't the ideal soldier. He seemed to be rather, shall we say, chill about the rules and regulations. It may have been because he was given very little military oversight, comparatively speaking, but he did develop into a bit of a bon vivant, a bit of a fan of parties and drugs and not wearing your uniform perfectly straight. Nevertheless, he continued rising through the ranks. This might also have been because, despite his occasionally rather unfastidious adherence to military protocol, he was known to be an ardent Japanese nationalist and a huge supporter of Emperor Hirohito. He was almost like an ideological commissar, utterly fearless in his loyalty, even going so far as to questioning the authority of superior officers if he felt they weren't ideologically pure enough. He also knew when to put in the effort to be meticulous. The only people who ever saw him with the shoulder pads not quite straight were people of his own rank, like his equals and his inferiors, and never his superiors. Whenever he was out there repping the set, everything was perfectly up to code, and that, combined with his fervor and his genius, earned him a lot of goodwill from the brass. To get back for a minute to the thing I said earlier about the new era of prosperity, the dawn of a Japanese golden age, in the military it was that times 10. You see, during the Meiji Restoration of 1865, it's a sort of a range of, but that's when historians set the date. The emperor managed to turn Japan from an isolationist feudal state into a high-tech global superpower in the span of just a few short years by mainly abolishing the Tokugawa shogunate. He, and by he I mean his advisors and the real power brokers of the era, because Emperor Meiji was 16 at the time, did this by adopting Western philosophies, ideals, technologies, and administrative principles, the key one of which was the concept of colonialism and imperialism. The new leadership class of Japan sort of figured that if Europeans could do it, so could they. And perhaps even more effectively, because they were much closer to those prized colonial holdings some of the already declining Western empires were struggling to hold on to. A big part of the reason why European powers were able to snatch up colonies in East Asia so easily was because both China and Japan had, for a while, had a sort of a very isolationist approach to external politics. So both of the major powers that could have been big players in the region were just not interested in doing anything, and also sort of crumbling internally from this isolation. But when Japan rose to contest those European claims, they were pretty good at it. Over the course of their imperial phase, they had colonies in Korea, Taiwan, Sakhalin, and territories that they controlled bordering from India to bordering Australia. And they were able to do this in part because of just how powerful the military was in relation to other state institutions. Most notably, there was no civilian oversight. The Minister of War didn't answer to the Prime Minister of Japan, but directly to the Emperor. And the Emperor, as a god, is not really all that involved in politics. At the time at which Shiro Ishii was rising through the ranks, the military was consolidating and growing and actively working against the state apparatus as part of a perceived loss of power and independence during the reign of the previous emperor. Yoshihito, posthumously known as Emperor Taisho, who reigned from 1912 to 1926, oversaw, not of his own volition mind you, a period wherein power shifted away from the powerful oligarchs of late Meiji Japan and toward a significant strengthening of the democratic organs of the Japanese Empire. Nationalism and colonialism were not the only concepts that had been imported from the West, and especially after World War I, when Japan was rather a wealthy nation and there was growing discontent in the colonies, liberalism made an appearance. In a country that had not really known the concept before, they actually established a lot of democratic institutions and civilian oversight, weakened the power of the noble families, and even introduced the notion that the policy of a country's government should serve the people of that country. They had women's suffrage and everything, like before most Western powers seriously did. With just the sheer volume of laws passed to strengthen things like labor unions and like anchoring the democracy aspect in the Constitution, it may have been the most progressive political movement in the world of its particular time. And it wasn't just the government doing this out of nowhere, it was a reflection of Japanese culture during the 1920s. A rich and diverse cultural tapestry where artists explored new Western concepts and mixed them with Japanese traditions. Pacifists, individualists, cosmopolitans held great sway in a society that was rapidly liberalizing. The military didn't like this at all. Like, they seriously hated the idea. The concept of rule by the people was new, at least to, being introduced in more parts of the world, but in Japan it had pretty much no historical precedent whatsoever, which is not true about the whole rule by the military thing. The ideological writings of the new hip young European political movement called fascism was getting very popular with like the Japanese military elite, especially the concept of a whole nation in service of its military. Everything drilled so there could be war and military action. They liked that. After all, Japan had been historically ruled by its military and security apparatus, aka the samurai and the shogun, for centuries. And yes, during these times, obviously the emperor was still the supreme ruler, the head of state, and what have you, but to give you a sort of more European frame of reference, the Japanese emperor is less like European emperors and more like the Pope. He's more like a spiritual leader. He's actually considered like a literal, actual god. And much like the primary function of the Pope is to preside over spiritual matters and to sort of legitimize the rule of the worldly leaders, which is something that the divine doesn't concern itself with, wink wink, it makes him more that, even though we call him an emperor. So as Japan in general started to radically and rapidly liberalize, the military leaders indoctrinated their troops with far-right ultranationalist ideology. They really launched into colonialism fully as a response to the Great Depression, to basically pillage wealth from the colonies, whereas the government, which was again and again elected by the people to be liberal pacifists, were again and again ordering them to stand down, which they just didn't do. After years of constant struggle between the democratic elements and the out-of-control Japanese security apparatus, the old military blood did eventually find ways of stopping the whole liberalization situation when Emperor Hirohito was sitting on the chrysanthemum throne, and to ensure no democracy like this could ever happen again, they began really growing their ranks, budget, and overall power. The Minister of War at the time, Sadao Araki, literally wanted to establish a military dictatorship with a figurehead emperor, and people who were not him but shared his vague ideology would eventually succeed. But all of this happened a bit later. Shiro Ishii, by 1928, was a rising star in this Japanese military currently engaged in the process of ousting the democratic institutions of the country. They were not quite in full control yet, but they were certainly out of control. Being who he was very interested in the field of biological warfare, which is, in case you don't know, using diseases as a weapon of war, which at that point in time was a fairly novel concept, even though it had been used historically. Everything in warfare was revolutionizing. Everything was being scaled up massively. And he really wanted to see what that could accomplish. And even though he was very young, he was one of the leading experts in this field in Japan at the time. To make him into an even bigger expert, he was sent to Europe and the United States of America to learn about their experiences with biological warfare during World War I. He went all over, but he spent the majority of his time in Germany, which was, in this brief interlude, still a liberal democracy with no imperialist ambitions, so they didn't keep a tight lid on their research. His reports earned Shiro Ishii the respect and support of even the most ideologically disparate wings of the military. Sadao Araki, the guy from earlier who wanted to establish a military dictatorship, he became one of his biggest supporters. That's a big name to have on your side. On the 1st of August 1936, a lieutenant colonel at the time, his desire to start a biological warfare program for Japan was granted, and he was placed in charge of Manchu Detachment 731, operating under the official cover name of Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army. And this is where we get to the really fucking dark part of the video. Now, the Kwantung Army was already a bit of a special place to be within the context of the Japanese military because it was the petri dish, haha, very funny, of this sort of hyper-nationalist, hyper-militarist ideology at the time. The military obviously had their outposts and their barracks all over the different colonies and territories that they controlled, and within those spaces, they could indoctrinate the soldiers much more easily because they didn't have any contact with the liberalization that was happening in Japan. It was much easier to demonize that whole idea. The Kwantung Army in Manchuria was there by international decree to protect a Japanese railway line. This had been the case for a while, but when the military saw the need and opportunity to do so, they orchestrated a false flag attack on the railway and then moved their troops into the larger area to make Manchuria into a colony of Japan. Except it wasn't really a colony of the government of Japan because the democratic government of Japan didn't know about this. They didn't authorize this, and after it happened, they repeatedly told the army to stand the fuck down. But the top guys in the Kwantung Army didn't really care. They had planned this for years. They knew the government had no recourse to control them. So what the Japanese government ended up doing was, in order to dissociate themselves a little bit from the actions of their military, which also wasn't of course possible because of the whole very complicated codes of honor that govern and governed even more so Japanese society back then, but also to sort of give a little bit of cheese to the security apparatus to make sure that they don't all suddenly turn on them. They recognized Manchukuo, as it was called, as a sort of semi-independent nation under the control of the Japanese military. So what you have here now is suddenly a colony administrated exclusively by a hyper-far-right military, not just militarist, military organization with no civilian oversight whatsoever. The Kwantung Army had total dominance over this large tract of resource-rich land with a lot of non-Japanese foreigners living in it. And they were going to exploit that in service of a totalitarian military state. And one of the main things that a totalitarian military state does is arrest people, actually, a lot of people, and then put them into prisons and jails for various bullshit trials to condemn them for things they didn't do or things that shouldn't be crimes. Located in the southern outskirts of Harbin, a major population center back in the day as it is now, Unit 731 was not designated as a prison necessarily. It was, in fact, officially a lumber mill. But it was the follow-up base to a much smaller military police prison where a lot of unethical medical research had happened already. Also, there's a retirement home on the site of Unit 731 today. As you can see, that's just something I found when I was taking these shots. The bulk of the people in Unit 731 were criminals. At least in the beginning, because, of course, when there's like a foreign power, militarist power, ravaging your homeland and they get to set the rules and they find out, we need more prisoners to do the things that we'd like to do, there's suddenly gonna be a lot more criminals because that's a very flexible definition. A lot of people were forced to steal to feed their families, so those were super easy pickings. But I want to make clear that the majority of the people in this facility and its sister facilities were not criminals of any description. Most of them were just civilians, political dissidents, prisoners of war, mostly Russians, Soviets from a war that had been happening and was still happening in some skirmishes around the area, and finally literally just people picked up off the street. You know the idea of loitering, like just hanging out in an area and how that can be illegal? Just put him in the wagon. There are like memos and diary entries of, oh, if I need a certain particular test subject for my kind of experiment that I have envisioned, I'll just take one of the military guys, tell them what I want, they'll drive into Harbin and just pick someone, just take him in, and maybe even a bunch of them. These are regular people with regular lives who just disappeared like that because the military ran into them. You need to understand that the Japanese did racism differently than, say, the Nazis. They were more like Americans, or the more traditional colonialist powers, where the whole idea of genocide was sort of falling out of favor a little bit with the general public. For the Nazis, the Jew was an enemy. There was a mythology built around Jews. They were pathetic and weak, yet also at the same time powerful and sneaky and cunning and smart, to like undermine the efforts of the Aryan race. They were bad, weak, and pathetic, and yet still extremely dangerous. I know this is contradictory and insane, but we're talking about far-right political ideology. What did you expect? But to the Japanese, other, like, ethnicities, races, especially, like, the Manchu Chinese, they weren't some sort of ontological enemy. They just sort of didn't see them as people. Like, they understood and saw that they functioned like human beings, but they weren't Japanese, so, you know, are they really people? They were basically animals identical to humans in all of the ways that mattered. People-shaped termites that were inhabiting a newly acquired tract of land. Their genocide was not perpetrated out of hatred, but simply because they were in the way. Given a position of power with little to no accountability, put at the helm of a top-secret military research installation to conduct the most unethical kind of medical science known to man, Shiro Ishii, who may up until this point have seemed human, dropped his mask. He had the freedom to pursue whatever kind of research he wished to pursue, and he had all the staff and money he wanted at his disposal. The primary research conducted on victims of Unit 731 was biological warfare testing. Imagine you are you, as you are right now, with friends, family, loved ones, passions, hobbies, dreams, aspirations, and you just get picked off the street on your way to the supermarket, sent to this facility full of foreign invaders and put into a holding cell. If you are lucky, you stay there for a few hours, not knowing what is going on. If unlucky, you are in there for days, until finally, a doctor in a lab coat comes in, smiling. "It's all right. Everything is fine. I'm just here to give you a vaccine." But they don't let you leave after the vaccine. You have to stay here in a dark, damp, claustrophobic prison cell. And after a few hours, the walls start creeping in. You've just been injected with a deadly disease, and Shiro Ishii is there to sort of watch what happens to you. He and his soldiers, and you and the other men, women, and children. I am now going to describe some of the diseases that were tested as biological warfare agents in Unit 731, and the slides I'll be showing will feature somewhat explicit imagery, like the kind of stuff that you find on Wikipedia. It's literally the stuff that is on the Wikipedia pages of those diseases. I will also be explaining the symptoms that can occur, but I will not be doing so using exclusively medical jargon, because medical jargon is designed to create a sort of degree of distance between yourself and the subject experiencing the disease. You kind of have to do that, otherwise all doctors would just go crazy. I believe that I must do my best to demonstrate, to show, to give you an actual impression of the fates of the Chinese civilians and Russian prisoners of war that were, the horrors that were enacted upon them by Shiro Ishii and his staff. I know I've warned you about this at the beginning of the video, and I'm warning you about it again, but if you are sort of sensitive to this kind of stuff, do skip this chapter of the video. Anthrax is a bacterial infection. The skin around your injection site begins to itch and swell, turn red and bloody like roasting pig as a black ulcer forms, a crust at the heart of the boils. Though it looks horrifying, it is at least painless. Chills run through your body, and the pressure builds on your lungs as they slowly begin to constrict. You don't know this, but it's because blood is accumulating in your chest cavity. You find it difficult to breathe, and the lack of oxygen makes you even weaker, less able to perform the gargantuan effort that is every single inhalation. Your mind begins to slip. You feel yourself vomiting out your very soul, the thick, acidic-smelling sludge mixed with the iron stench of blood. You don't even have time to think of the humiliation as figures in protective gear come into your cell to study the bloody diarrhea caked onto your arse. Time is no longer flowing like it should. The all-encompassing thrum of the fever has already taken your mind. Botulism is especially lethal in children. It starts gradually, as a feeling of weakness takes hold in your muscles and bones. It becomes more and more difficult to move, as the bacteria produce a toxin that blocks your brain's ability to communicate with your muscles. You collapse, slink against the ice-cold tiles of the wall, as even the act of keeping your eyelids open becomes a Herculean effort. There is no merciful fever to take you away from experiencing this. Though your eyes are closed, you are wide awake. You can feel the air leaving your lungs as all your focus is in the very concept of continuing to breathe. This simple act you do every second of every day is impossible now. Primal terror grips you as you find yourself unable to pull in more air. All the panic of holding your breath, the reflex of drawing in at the forefront of your mind, but you simply can't do it. If you are lucky, you will feel the rubbery touch of medical gloves as you are intubated by strong men with no concern for your well-being. You will remain in this void of consciousness for weeks, if not months. Though let's be honest, given where you are, who you are to these people, You know you will just remain unable to breathe. The bubonic plague starts like a simple flu. Your mind drones inside your skull as fever takes hold, and reality blends with the burning pain of a headache drilling into every corner of your consciousness. Your muscles start to spasm uncontrollably, and you find your hands and feet blackened with necrosis as they begin to die alongside your inner organs. Dull yet searing pain pulsates on your neck, under your armpits, in your groin, as hidden lymph nodes start to swell, feeling like they will pop. Black pustules appear on your skin, burning like death. You are seized by a coughing fit until you vomit blood. Though you don't understand what is happening, or why it is happening, you know that you are being eaten alive. Cholera does not announce itself. It just happens to you. From one moment to the next, you find yourself vomiting almost clear water. At the same time, diarrhea bursts out of your anus. You don't have time to do both. The whitish liquid stinks like rotting fish. It is now in your cell. No one will come to clean it up. Over the course of the next few hours, you feel yourself weaken as sudden bursts of vomiting and diarrhea expel all the water from your body. Your skin begins to turn blue and wrinkle. You lose control of your muscles as your body struggles to find the electrolytes necessary for proper functioning. Through the cold haze, you know that you need water. It is all you can think of. Your body craves it more than it ever has before. But no water comes. Or maybe some water comes. The faceless men behind their impenetrable masks are curious to see how long one can survive on various different amounts of water. They may give you some, but it does nothing to quench your thirst, as it is distilled. You no longer have the faculties to understand this, but they are also curious to see how desperate you get. After all, there's plenty of liquid in your cell. Buckets full of revolting excrement, the thought of which only forces more caustic liquid up your throat. But your mouth, your tongue, is so very, very parched. Smallpox is a horror you are likely familiar with from horrible stories of outbreaks that have happened. As such, when your headaches and fatigue begin to make way for painful red spots on the roof of your mouth, you sense a feeling of dread as you realize what is about to befall you. Small black lumps, not unlike birthmarks, begin appearing on your face, slowly spreading to the rest of your body. They pulsate with a dull, thrumming pain, almost unnoticeable over the razor-sharp rasp that every inhale, every exhale is to your mouth, throat, and lungs. Eventually, when your entire body is covered, the first of the pockmarks, now painfully swollen, like hundreds of needles spaced along your skin, start to hemorrhage. An acrid, pus-like substance flows out of them like grey tree sap. Your skin begins shedding these macules. Many become infected in the filthy conditions of your frigid cell. If you are lucky enough to survive, you will be scarred for the rest of your existence. But you don't even have the comfort of knowing that the rest of your days will be brief. Not all the diseases went like this. Obviously, these are just individual descriptions of how these diseases could go. Some of the victims received some forms of usually experimental treatment to see whether or not it would work. Unit 731 was also a development and manufacturing site for biological weapons, which then were used against civilian populations, just towns, villages, small cities in Manchuria. Shiro Ishii had personally developed and championed an initiative called Operation PX, wherein kamikaze pilots would fly to San Diego and Los Angeles with strains of diseases that had been developed in Unit 731 labs. The plan was delayed repeatedly because the Japanese military brass had concerns about it, though whether those concerns were ethical, I don't know. It just says they had doubts about it. I reckon they didn't have ethical ones. The only reason it was never deployed ultimately was because the war ended. Shiro Ishii wanted to deploy these diseases against American soldiers in Japan, which they then perceived as occupiers, which, oh my god, it's so bad being occupied by foreigners. But the Japanese military brass, the thing that remained of it, the sort of underground resistance, if you will, they said, don't do that maybe, because Japanese civilians will also die, and that's a problem. Many of the diseases tested in these labs were not lethal necessarily in most cases, and some of the victims that received treatment especially actually survived, only to then be reinserted into new experiments, whether that be to be reinfected with new diseases or new strains of the same disease or the same strain of the same disease to see how immunity would build up over time, or entirely different experiments. Because there are a lot of those, and though I will spare you the vivid experiential narration of what it feels like to be subject to those, what I'm about to describe is nonetheless rather horrid. Victims would be stripped naked and just sort of hung up, either in the heat of summer or cold of winter, just to see how long they would last against the elements. Various kinds of experimental protective gear was tested by setting victims on fire. Many were buried alive with a certain amount of access to air, various different levels of it, and small observational setups to see how long it took for them to expire. Experimentation in chemical warfare, including poisons and venoms, also happened, but mainly it was gas. In terms of the former ricin and pufferfish venom, the kind of stuff that they serve in restaurants now, but they take out the venom, the fugu type deals, those were tested extensively. They have a similar effect to botulism, where they essentially make you unable to breathe just very quickly. Victims were basically tied down in glass chambers that were airtight and then blasted with white phosphorus or mustard gas, which essentially what those do is they melt you from the inside. I suppose in terms of chemical weapons research, the ones who were just injected with a lethal dose of heroin were the lucky ones. Another preferred type of experiments was to sort of tie victims onto the ground and then crush them with heavy objects, preferably by adding more and more weight to it over time so the process wouldn't be quick and instant, but long and excruciating. Some victims were put into hot air tunnels where they were kept for hours and days to see how long it would take for them to be completely desiccated. A related series of experiments would gradually burn more and different and specific areas of the victim's body, the skin and internal organs. They were trying it all just to see what kind of burns and what amount of burns would make a victim die of pain. Others were simply starved in various different ways, looking at what nutrients the body could do without for the longest periods of time. Another simple and straightforward one was electrocutions. Those happened pretty much every day. They had a whole setup where they would blast victims with lethal doses of radiation, primarily X-rays, because that is fairly easy to control outside of it, and then they would just sort of sit there and watch as their bodies fell apart because the binding tissues, the literal connections in the cells had just been obliterated by the radiation. During the winters, a particularly meticulous series of frostbite experiments were performed where victims would have their limbs frozen and then struck to see what kind of sounds they might produce. And then they had experimental and pretty much guaranteed not to work treatments that might maybe potentially work, I imagine, in some sort of dream world, applied to the skin or the organs to see if they would recover, which they usually didn't. Another one, also just as horrid, was that people were getting injected with the wrong blood type to see what would happen, or even worse, straight up animal blood. Some were even injected with salty seawater. In a very popular series of other experiments, they went the other way and looked how much blood you could drain from a person before they died, and how much you could take away and then re-inject into them, and they would still be alive afterwards. They built giant centrifuges to spin people to death. Low pressure chambers to see how much it would take to make someone's eyes pop from their sockets. And to turn back to the diseases for a moment, syphilis was very common for the prisoners. It was one of the diseases studied, and instead of just injecting people with it, the guards and scientists rather amused themselves by forcing the prisoners to rape each other in order to pass the disease along. Rape, as such, was extremely common in Unit 731. One of the main reasons for it is so they would have pregnant women and also children to perform all of the aforementioned experiments on. This place existed for many years. They knew they had time for this. And I haven't even gotten to the vivisections yet. If you don't know, a dissection is basically another word for autopsy. You cut a dead body open to see what happened and how it died. A vivisection is that, but the victim is still alive, which has the distinct advantage of, at least for a while, allowing you to see the actual processes that are occurring in the body. And for most of the victims that survived any of these experiments, this was the preferred method of studying what had happened. They weren't given sedatives, just tied down and cut into pieces. A thing that happened multiple times is that they would cut off both arms and attach them to the other side of the body, just to see what would happen. Oh, and did I mention pregnant women were a favorite candidate for these vivisections? During the Japanese occupation of China, somewhere between 8 and 12 million Chinese died. It's difficult to get accurate numbers on this, but Unit 731 and its various subunits and field teams, like Unit 100 and Unit 517, were responsible from anywhere between 300,000 and 500,000 of these deaths. Shiro Ishii and his biowarfare operation is responsible for a significant chunk of the total death count. And the question is, how could something like this even happen? There were up to 10,000 people working under Shiro Ishii during the peak of his operation. Many of them were renowned scientists and high-ranking military figures. What exactly went on in Unit 731 was known to Shiro Ishii's superiors. Why did no one put a stop to this? It's the same question as with the Holocaust, where you had entire cities in a whole country, several countries, just sort of look away. And the contained nature of Unit 731, the military internal structure, made it even worse. You have an utter dehumanization of the victims, a complete desensitization of the staff. When one is part of such a thing, one compartmentalizes things like this so as to not be crushed by the overwhelming guilt. And a major part of this is ideological indoctrination, dehumanization, thinking you are doing this not really to people. And there are other mechanisms with which this dehumanization is further exacerbated. Remember how I said that the whole facility officially ran as a lumber mill? The staff of Unit 731 referred to their victims as logs. Many actually jokingly use the German word Holzklotz, which means log of wood. And look, I'm aware that it sounds made up, but it is actually a real German word. When asking how many victims had died in the experiments, scientists would inquire as to how many logs had fallen. Many of the researchers even published their findings in peer-reviewed journals, referring to the victims they were experimenting on as Manchurian monkeys, and pretending that they had performed animal trials. There was also the notion that, of course, if you did somehow speak out against the cruelty performed, you would probably end up as a Holzklotz yourself. And let's not forget the sheer extent of how hard these people were indoctrinated into the far-right ideology of Japanese militarism. But of course, it wasn't just that. Needing that kind of compartmentalization, you need to be able to feel guilt and remorse in the first place. What Shiro Ishii had built here as his own personal paradise was also a playground for psychopaths. Even though the facility was secret, word, of course, gets around that such a place exists, especially to the kinds of people who might be interested in working in a place like this. If you were the kind of person who had always dreamed of shock freezing a baby and then smashing it with a hammer, you would eventually hear of Unit 731. You would gravitate towards it. It was the kind of place where they would say, just one baby, take two, we have enough to spare. As a matter of fact, because it's your first day here and we want to make you feel welcome, take three. Don't have too much fun now. Not only had far-right ideology completely dehumanized the Chinese civilians, just living their lives, having loved ones, being regular human beings, a lot of the people in Unit 731 didn't see anyone but themselves as fully human in the first place. And in a very literal sense, chief among them was Shiro Ishii. He was the mastermind, the darkest sadist, the demon of Unit 731. But hey, at least we know that the Japanese lost. They didn't win the war, they got nuked by the United States twice. If Shiro Ishii wasn't killed as an enemy combatant, at least he was tried for war crimes. In the final days of the war, Soviet troops were advancing on Unit 731, and it was clear that they would soon take the facility. Shiro Ishii and his staff, perhaps knowing of what was already happening in Germany and the kinds of atrocities that had been uncovered there, and the reactions to those atrocities, decided to gas the remaining 300 victims and hide the bodies. More than twice that, in terms of forced laborers, were just shot in the head. Ishii personally handed out cyanide pills to the staff, telling them to flee and, if they were captured, to take them, so no one would ever find out what had happened at Unit 731. He understood that what had happened there was wrong, in a way that the word wrong cannot fully encapsulate. They all did. They all knew, and now it was time to protect themselves. They shelled their own facility to destroy as much of the evidence as possible as the Soviets approached. Shiro Ishii fled back to the Japanese mainland, where he was eventually captured by the US military. When General Douglas MacArthur, the Allied commander of the Pacific Theater, was briefed on what had transpired in Unit 731, he acted quickly to secure as much of the evidence and research data gathered as possible, by, among other things, threatening the potential informants to get the Soviets involved. They had already captured 12 ranking members of the Kwantung Army, several of them leadership staff from Ishii's operations. They were tried for war crimes in Khabarovsk and sentenced to anywhere between 2 and 25 years of labor camp. None were sentenced to death, and all who were still in labor camp 7 years later were sent back to Japan. MacArthur's main trump card that he used to get the people who worked at Unit 731, including Shiro Ishii, to speak, was the offer of immunity. You see, he wasn't collecting all this evidence so he could mount a proper prosecution of Japanese war crimes. War crimes against what? People who lived in communist China? The Soviet Union? What he wanted was the research data, because he reckoned that the findings had to be so very good given all the ethics that American scientists in America had to follow with their experiments. So if the science had been conducted using extremely cruel methods, the research gained from it would be invaluable. And especially given the fact that the data concerned biological weapons research, only America, and especially not the Soviets, should have access to that research data. And so a massive cover-up was orchestrated by the American government. This led to a complete dismissal of charges of biological warfare performed by the Japanese military against Chinese civilian populations at the Tokyo War Crime Tribunal. The prosecution didn't have the evidence and probably didn't even know the full extent of the atrocities committed in Unit 731. The US government did not give a shit about this. They just wanted their data under lock and key, and if hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians had died for that, had been forgotten for that, would never even long after their deaths see some sort of inkling of justice for the atrocities that had been committed against them, that's fine. Completely fine. And you know, the funniest bit about all of this is that it was all for nothing. The insights into biological warfare that the Americans had hoped to gain within the research of Shiro Ishii and his band of demons did not materialize because that research was not scientifically valuable. Not only did it very quickly become clear that most of the insights were already known, but most of the experiments conducted at Unit 731 were not designed, controlled, or put to paper in a scientifically useful manner. Most of the researchers at Unit 731 did their work sloppily and without good reason. And this isn't because Japanese and Western approaches to science are somehow culturally different. The Japanese researchers were trained in the same scientific principles as researchers in the West. They had the same underlying philosophical considerations, the same methods to make sure that the insights you gain from observing reality in experimental setups were accurate. It's just extremely obvious that they didn't do it for that reason, and so they disregarded those scientific principles. The science was just a pretext to hurt people. It was a method of dehumanizing their victims in order to torture them for their own enjoyment. This is why I've tried my best not to use the word subject at any point in this video. I always called them victims because there was no science involved in any of this. At the end of the day, in addition to there not being any form of justice, the deaths of those hundreds of thousands of forgotten souls is not even vindicated by some sort of medical breakthrough, some sort of knowledge gained from that research that is saving lives today. It was all utterly pointless. And the man responsible for all of it was never punished. Even after having learned nothing, and knowing exactly what he had done, the United States government went to considerable expense to protect Shiro Ishii. And not because he was some Wernher von Braun type figure where you could at least argue in some fucked up sense that he was a deeply unethical man pursuing a dream that would bring great benefit to humanity. Shiro Ishii was evil for the sake of being evil. He was a sadist who spent years of his life living in his personal sadism heaven, and the United States decided that he shouldn't be punished for it. The people who worked at Unit 731, the only survivors because none of the victims survived, they would have meetups. Years later, they would hang out in Japan, get drunk, and reminisce about the good old days. One of the things that I try to do in Interesting Lives, even for the monsters, is to find out things about their personal lives, their families, their mundane existence, because I don't like the idea that we never see anyone as anything else than human. Be that as a demystification or a cautionary tale on how there is a monster in all of us. I was not able to find much on Shiro Ishii. I know he had at least one daughter, but that's it. Nothing about any partners, close friends, hobbies, residences. In fact, after the war ended, he just sort of vanished, living out the rest of his days God knows where. I would have tried some more Japanese sources, but Japan doesn't actually teach this kind of stuff. The official school curriculum denies the various atrocities and genocides their ancestors committed. And you will find comments underneath this video that would make a Holocaust denier's skin crawl. The only for sure record I have of his reappearance that isn't just speculation is of his death. He had cancer of the larynx and died on the 9th of October 1959 in Tokyo. Shortly before his death, he was baptized as a Catholic, washing away all his sins in the eyes of God. A final means of evading justice, even in the afterlife. A sore throat and trouble speaking. That's all of the punishment Shiro Ishii ever received. He was 67 years old when he died. Not super old, but pretty old. He got to live a long life. He got to get away with everything that he did. And so did most of the people working for him. Hell, even of the small, tiny, not even a handful of people that were punished by the Soviets to work in a gulag for however many years, all of the ones that were still there after 7 years were just sent back to Japan. That is the most anyone has been punished for the things that happened in Unit 731. 7 years in a Soviet gulag. On an unrelated note, there was an incident of Japanese scientists who vivisected American pilots that had crash-landed. They were sentenced to death at a tribunal in Yokohama by the US military. And that's it. That's the life of Shiro Ishii. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope it has cured you of your belief in karma. I'm not gonna plug any of my shit. It feels wrong to do that. I feel like there's a responsibility to the huge amorphous mass of faceless forgotten victims. People need to know about this because they don't teach this. You don't learn this shit at school. You read it on Wikipedia. You know, at least the Holocaust, they did the work of going through what happened. And with this, they've just forgotten about it. They just pretend like it never happened. And they go, oh look, the charges were dismissed at the war crime trials. Yeah, that's because America decided that Shiro Ishii should get away scot-free. And that just fucks me up.